Hello and welcome everyone to Wisdom of the Mystics. And what a great wonder and honor it is to be here with you all today as we come here twice a month and we get to deepen into the mystical roots of our teachings of New Thought, knowing that every time we learn about yet another mystic, that it really touches our lives and allows us to live our lives in a more awakened and enlightened way. And so I'm Reverend Kathy Mastroianni, Executive Director of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. And it is just a joy and honor to be with you today. And we get to learn about yet another new mystic. And again, I'm with the Science Mind Archives, which we're really here to preserve, protect, and present science of mind wisdom and philosophy for all of us. Our website, sciencemindarchives.com, is just so, it's just a great place to learn more. And so I'm honored here. I'm going to let my beautiful, lovely co-host, Laura Topper, introduce herself and a little bit more, and she's going to introduce our super guest and our mystic. So thank you, Laura.
Oh, thank you, Reverend Kathy. It's so great to be here again this week. It's amazing how 2 weeks it goes so quickly, and it's always really exciting. Looking forward to the new guest that's coming on and the presentation of our mystic each and every week. And here we are at the end of June, feeling, wow, this is such a blessing. All of the great presenters that have been on the show here on New Thought Media Network. And today's guest, well, I'm just feeling really humbled and grateful and blessed that Reverend Mark Gilbert is here backstage, waiting to come on, which he will do in a moment, to come share his knowledge and wisdom of William Walker Atkinson. And I know that Reverend Mark has an incredible blog, which is really more of an educational experience. Every week, Reverend Mark creates writings about teachers, New Thought, Science of Mind teachings as well, and focuses in on certain mystics. And so when I put this idea forward to Reverend Mark for coming on, and he said, I know who I'd like to present. And later he said, no, actually, I've changed my mind. I really know who I would like to present. And Reverend Mark does so much great work in the world as Center for Spiritual Living minister. And of course, he was chair or director of the Global Services Committee for a while. When I was kind of crossing over, I was there with him as well, which was great to be there in the beginning with Reverend Mark for me. And Reverend Mark, I know, is a leader on the Leadership Council of the Science of Mind Archives. So his knowledge is absolutely tapped into in so many ways in our spiritual community as he shares his wisdom with the world. So I'm going to bring you on right now, Mark Gilbert. Thank you so much for being here today and for sharing and shining the light on this incredible mystic that I know you've really delved into and have researched in many ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laura, for the beautiful introduction, and thank you, Kathy, as well. And it's good to see my good friends here today, and also good to come with you and share about William Walker Atkinson, whom I think a lot of New Thought and people are not aware of or don't know much about. And so I'm excited that we might be introducing someone new to a lot of people today.
Oh, that's good. That's what we like. Bring in the new awareness. Yeah,
I will say this. You were talking about when you first contacted me, and I originally was thinking about Christian D. Larson. I wrote an article for Science of Mind magazine a number of years ago by Christian D. Larson, and as part of the research on that, I had there's a long story I could go into, and maybe I'll do that in a future one. Maybe if we do Larson in the future, I'd love to come back and talk about him because there's actually a lot of similarities between Larson and Atkinson, whom we're discussing today. But I know that when we talk about the wisdom of the mystics and New Thought, there's all the common people that if you're in New Thought, you hear about, Emerson or Judge Troward or Emma Curtis Hopkins or Phineas Quimby. There's the key people who are key essence of teachers and key touchstones for the changes that brought about and led to the philosophy of New Thought that we always go back to. But there are so many other people out there, especially the late 1800s and early 1900s. There was a really broad number of folks who served as a conduit for bringing together all of these various aspects of mental science into the philosophy we call New Thought these days, and none more so than the guy we're going to be talking about today, William Walker Atkinson, whom I got to confess, I really wasn't that aware of who he was until late last year. I think he just sort of like skated by my awareness, and I'll simply say this as a sort of a precursor to getting into talking about him, is that I was going through an organization of all these books behind me. My wife and I've got, I don't know, way too many books, 2,500, something like that. And we had done some renovating, and I moved all the books out and all the books back, and they were not in any order. So I decided to sit down and go through all my books and put them in like groupings by category. And I was also updating a database I've got with a website called Library Thing, where I was updating my data. And as part of all of that, I kept finding books I wanted to read. I go, oh my God, I didn't know, I forgot I had that book. And I think we've all had that experience of buying books and going, where the heck did that come from? I didn't even know it was on my shelves. And one that I discovered and pulled off as part of that was this one. It's called The Cabalian by William Walker Atkinson, writing his 3 initiates, and we'll talk about it later. But it was actually by discovering that book, it got into a stack of books that I said, I've got to start reading these books. And it wasn't the first one I got to. The first ones were some by Donald Curtis, who's a New Thought teacher of the mid-20th century. But then I got to this book, and I read it and went all the way through it. And I said, God, this was a good book. Why did I not know about this book? Somehow or another, I bought it and then just stuck it on my shelf. So there was some synchronistic event that led me to getting it. And the book was so wonderful that I rarely do this. As soon as I finished reading it, I started over reading it again because it was that good. Wow. And it said so many things to me that made so much clarity, that brought into focus about Science of Mind. That since that time, I've been recommending this book left and right to folks and encouraging them to read it. And what's interesting is it was published in 1908, and it's that old. But it speaks to where we are and who we are these days, and it helped clarify concepts of Ernest Holmes and Science of Mind and other things that I saw them in a new light just simply by reading that book. And the other interesting thing is, as soon as I read it and I started going down, well, why did I not know about this book? I went off and started doing like quick research, and come to find out, it's been having sort of a renaissance in the last 10, 20 years. I think because when it hit the 100-year anniversary, it had always been a popular book, but new editions came out. Not only the one I was mentioning here, but there's another one called that was the Centenary edition that's come out, and they're both excellent copies. So it's not a really thick book, and it's very, very great in terms of its content and its voice. But that said, not only do I recommend reading that book, but it made me wonder, who is this guy? And so as I did this research, one of the first things I discovered is that there were some videos out there by our good friend Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is, of course, a New Thought author in his own right, and He's published a New Thought historian book called One Simple Idea. And Mitch has some YouTube videos I discovered where he's talking about the Cabalian and discovering it and having the same experience I had about reading it. You know, he sort of encountered it, thought, it's crazy. He comes back and reads the whole thing and then reads it almost immediately in full, and then starts doing videos and talks about it. And then recently there was a movie that he and some other people put together all about the Cabalian and the concepts in it. So that came out in the last year or so. And so all of this is like hitting at the same time,
Wow.
these new editions of the book and people putting videos out. And so, you know, there's a lot there, but that brings us to who the heck wrote it and who is William Walker Atkinson. So, yeah.
Yes.
So you want me to talk about that?
Wow. Thank you so much for explaining that and the journey of how you are here now with the book. That's incredible that you found it.
Yeah.
And here you are with it. I love it.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about who he is, and just as a background. And you know, he was born in 1862. He was in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a lawyer, and he had an interest in the occult and studying Eastern religions and things of that nature. He moved, and because of a snafu in his move, they said, you've got to reapply for the bar. So he had a period of time where he didn't have his status as a lawyer. So he used his interest in the occult and mental sciences to start writing in that area. He did eventually get his bar license back and still was a practicing lawyer. But he also had, because of the stresses of being a lawyer, he writes later in life about the fact that those stresses made him question the path he was on as being a lawyer and all the things that he was doing and having to do in terms of that and the illnesses that was bringing about. And so in that, he decided to practice some of the concepts of mental science and mental healing that he was reading and studying, and discovered that they helped him through this crisis. So he then says he wants to learn more about these things that have helped him personally. And he starts studying New Thought and other esoteric concepts. He obviously, and I think one of the big questions is where did he get his information from? And Mitch Horowitz in his book, One Simple Idea, says that Atkinson studied with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who we all know as one of the, teacher of teachers, that she taught Ernest Holmes, and she taught the Fillmores, who started Unity, and she taught many of the people who were influential in divine science and so many others. But, apparently Atkinson moved to Chicago and did study at a time with Emma Curtis Hopkins. He also studied, according to Mitch, with a woman by the name of Wilmans. I'm sorry, excuse me, just a second. He studied with Helen Wilmans. Helen is a famous early New Thought writer who has an interesting story in her own right. She was a housewife who followed her father or her husband around the country. He went out to the West in the gold rush and had some successes and failures. And long story short, she leaves her husband and goes and studies and becomes a New Thought teacher, and has people who are writing into her for correspondence lessons. And she ends up starting the town of Seabreeze, Florida, with her husband, where they publish and sell New Thought teachings. And because of a move of a post office, she has some bouts with the postal authorities in the United States, and they ended up temporarily shutting her down. But so she's this other New Thought teacher that was influential on Atkinson. And Atkinson also met and studied with one of the early Eastern yogis who came to the U.S. His name was Baba Bharati. And Atkinson and he are known to have had contacts and had a friendship. And in fact, Atkinson wrote for a small time for Bharati's magazine called The Light of India. But long story short, you got this guy who's a lawyer, legal mind, who can take stuff, complex ideas, and sort of boil them down into easy to understand chunks of ideas. He's got an occult interest, and through some life challenges, he sort of shifts from being a lawyer into being an occult teacher. And through that, he moves from Baltimore into Pennsylvania, and then on into Chicago, and starts working for a guy as editing a magazine. which was called the Journal of Magnetism. And this was in the year 1901 that he takes on the editorship of this thing, a guy by the name of Sidney Flower, another early New Thought proponent who had a lot of magazines that he published back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Atkinson becomes the editor for his magazine and encourages him to change the name to New Thought. So Atkinson starts writing New Thought articles. But, the interesting side note is Atkinson's very first published article was in a magazine called Modern Thought, which is now known under the name of Unity. And it was published by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. And the Fillmores published this magazine, and it was back actually in 1889 that Atkinson wrote an article called A Mental Science Catechism that was published in Fillmore's magazine in 1889. But it's you jump forward to 1900, he moves to Chicago. He publishes his first book. It's called Thought Force in Business and Everyday Life. Obviously, he's interested in the power of thoughts and thought force. And then he becomes the editor of the Journal of Magnetism, which changes its name to New Thought. And he's the editor off and on for New Thought magazine until 1910. And during his tenure, the magazine's circulation grew from 4,500 to over 100,000 people. So in that brief time, just to show the number who were reading. And it was one of so many New Thought publications. Now, here's the interesting thing is that Atkinson often, why do we not know about him? Well, there's two big reasons that we don't know so much about him. One is that he published a lot of his stuff under other names. Oh. And he also didn't start an organization. That he saw himself as a synthesizer and teacher and writer of mystical concepts. And he put them out not only in his own magazine, but also wrote for other people's magazines. I mentioned Baba Bharati's Science of India, The Light of India magazine. Atkinson wrote for that, but he also wrote for Elizabeth Towne and her magazine Nautilus. Many people who studied early New Thought are probably familiar with the Nautilus magazine. It was one of the most famous New Thought magazines, and during the period of later in his life, from 2012 to 1912 to 1920, Atkinson wrote not only for other magazines, but wrote for Elizabeth Towne's magazine as well. And then later he came back and edited a magazine called Advanced Thought from 1916 to 1922. So for many years he was a magazine writer. But here's the kind of the funny, cool thing is that oftentimes you'd look at the masthead of the magazine and it would list a number of names of people. And it would look like it was a lot of different people. But a lot of those other people were pseudonyms of Atkinson writing their name. And the other...
I know, right?
Yeah.
Funny.
And one of his most famous ones was a name called Yogi Ramachakaraka. And he published about 13 books. In fact,
can you hold that up a little bit closer, Reverend Mark, to the screen?
Science of Breath. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Science of Breath. Wow.
Yeah. He wrote
named himself as Yogi Ramachakara.
Yeah, and they created this mythical backstory about who.
There you go. Thank you. Right.
Ramachakaraka. And they created a backstory about this being an Indian who had come to the U.S. or had been this wise Indian and wanted to bring yogic traditions to the U.S. And so people wonder, how did Atkinson learn what he knew about yogic traditions in Hinduism? There's a concern that maybe he might be learned it from Baba Bharati, who I mentioned a couple of times. But there also, there were other publications out there that he could read and synthesize. And I think that, the Gita was out there in English at that time. And in fact, he published one under the Ramachakaraka name, a translation of the Bhagavad Gita later on. But so Atkinson was bringing forth to the American public all kinds of esoteric stuff, but he was also a New Thought writer. And he wrote and studied a lot of mental science and New Thought things. And so his magazines would have these articles by different names. He wrote under the name of Swami Bhakti Vishita. He wrote under the name Swami Panchardasi. He wrote under as a Frenchman, a supposed Frenchman called Theron Q. Dermot. He wrote one book under the interesting name of Magnus Incognito. That happened to be a book about Rosicrucianism.
Wow.
And he wrote under his own name.
That's quite a cool name.
Yeah. In all total, he has about 100 books out there, and they're all in the public domain. And people can go and find them, for free. But there's also low-cost editions they can find. But he's an interesting writer. And one of the things that you might say, why did he write under all these different names? There's a number of reasons. One, when he was publishing his magazine, it made it look like multiple people were writing the magazine and not just him. And then he would take the series of articles that he wrote, and put them into a book that would publish by himself. He would take the articles that were written by Yogi Ramachakarika and put them into a book, and then by some of these other names as well. So he would write under these names for his magazines and then aggregate the articles by those people into books by these other names. And he had a theme or topics. Every person who wrote had sort of an essence. So the Eastern philosophy and Hinduism were the Yogi Ramachakarika books. But he also wrote, a lot of self-help and positive thinking and new psychology books that he published under his own name as Atkinson or under other names. And the books when he became a Frenchman, pretended to be a Frenchman, those were generally business-oriented books. They were books that were using the concepts of New Thought and the mental sciences to teach business concepts to people. And he wrote them under this Frenchman's name. So you've got 100 books. Many of them were co-authored with a lot of them were co-authored with other books. And he was a synthesizer of so much knowledge and wisdom, and is often considered one of the proponents of really bringing Eastern philosophy to the U.S. through his writings as this yogi. So, and when you read these, they are exercises in breathing and physical concepts and things of that nature, but they're also changing your thinking. They're flavored with the concepts of New Thought and how to change your thinking and change your life. So Atkinson is somebody that people ought to know about. And there's a really wonderful Wikipedia page about him. I also would recommend, I've got a lot of resources on my Conscious Bridge website. People can go there, and if they go to the link for New Thought for resources, the resource library, if they go to New Thought,
they can put that here.
Yeah. And just if they go to the page on New Thought, they'll find a link for authors, and they'll follow the links, and you'll find a page on William Walker Atkinson, and there's links to tons of free downloads of PDFs and Kindle versions of most of his books that you can download for free, and background information, and links to Mitch Horowitz's videos and other things are on my website. But the Wikipedia page, Wikipedia's name, and that's a good start for you right there.
Wow, thank you.
My word.
I overwhelmed you.
No, it was wonderful.
Oh, it's intriguing.
Yes.
How he tuned into so you go, Reverend Kathy.
I just was going to say that I'm so grateful to learn about him, and I just love his Eastern philosophy that he's bringing in, because that was very influential for Ernest Holmes. Towards the end of his life, he was studying Sri Aurobindo, and I mean, just kind of fascinating that he took on this persona of an Eastern yogi. And during the time, Paramahansa Yogananda came to the United States in 1920, and so they just celebrated the 100th anniversary of Yogananda. And at the Parliament of the World's Religions, there was a famous yogi, I think it was Vivekananda.
Right, in 1893. Yeah, many thought that Atkinson and he met, although there's no evidence of that.
Okay, I was wondering actually that too. But it's just, he must have so embodied this teaching, that he could, speak to it and write to it. and become it in a way.
Yes, yes, and bring it out so that people think that he really is who he is in terms of these alternate personas. One of the things when you start reading about him, you start wondering, well, who else knew about him? And obviously he was really in the mix back in the early New Thought influences. Charles Braden, in his famous history of New Thought that he wrote back in the 1960s, he references Atkinson only a couple of times, and one of those times is to mention that Atkinson was a major influence on Fenwick Holmes, of course, Ernest Holmes' brother. So Ernest obviously knew about Atkinson, and you talk about Holmes you're reading The Life Divine and Aurobindo late in life. One of the things, if you go back and read the George Bindle's bringing forth the transcripts of Holmes from his later years. I think they recently were republished as the Holmes Papers, and but they were under that it was Holmes talking to various groups in the 1950s and in the latter stages of Holmes' teachings, and one of those things is a history of New Thought, and when you read that history, there is a reference in there. He for several paragraphs, he talks about the Hermetic teachings and Hermes and the ancient Egypt influences, which I had never heard before until I was rereading that. And so not only was Aurobindo, because I'd heard that a lot, about Aurobindo and his influence on Holmes, but I always sort of wondered, well, what did Holmes think in terms of going back to some of the Hermetic teachings of ancient Egypt? And he references those as a key aspect of aspects of the teachings of science of mind, and that really links us to the book, The Cabalian, that Walker wrote. And what I might just mention is that he published this book in 1908. But it's often cited as one of the biggest influences on occult and metaphysical teachings throughout the 20th century. It's only through research in the last 20 years has it really been nailed down definitively that Atkinson wrote this book.
I was wondering, actually.
Yeah, and if you there's a historian who writes a wonderful introduction to this definitive edition of the Cabalian, and Philippe Deslippe is how I'm saying it, but it's probably pronounced some other way. But he writes a wonderful background article not only about Atkinson, but about how the evidence that Atkinson wrote the Cabalian, including the fact that Atkinson wrote his own Who's Who of in America writing one year and submitted it as a book he had written, and that the French edition of the Cabalian cites Atkinson as the author. But because for many years it was written and is published under the name Three Initiates, people were often wondering, who are these three initiates and
who are they?
Who are they? And I think Deslippe in his intro makes a definitive case for linking Atkinson to the book, The Cabalian. So let me talk a bit about the Cabalian. The Cabalian.
So could I just say? I'd like to just say one thing before you, because I know you're going to go and it's going to be. I'm just feeling the gratitude for you bringing this forwards, because he was very creative to be thinking. Right, I'm gonna write for one audience, and I'm gonna write in a different way for another audience, and yet it may be all one and the same audience. But he was using new thoughts. Actually, he was using new thought in the way that he was authoring the principles in these different ways by reaching different people in different ways with his message. It's ingenious, I think.
It really is, and it was a product of the time too. That they were really, you tried to meet the audience where the audience were, and the very nature that you would say, well, what's going to lend some credence and authority to this if I'm going to write on Eastern religion? Well, it's a yogi, obviously, and I've got to be this Eastern person who's writing this, and it's a common thing to try to bring some sort of credence and background story that gives some value, so people will hook into it a little more. And it was very wise on his part. And he's using the concepts to also bring it about, and he tells people, even in his writings, try them out. If you don't like them, discard them and test something else. And probably if you test something else, it's going to be another one of his books under another name.
One of his.
That's funny.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had the honor of taking Dr. Tom Sanders' class. He took the extension study course to The Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes, and he did all 48 weeks of it. And he absolutely referenced the Cabalian too. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And so to hear it come back again today with you and learning more about William Walker Atkinson is just really fascinating. And so again, it's definitely part of New Thought and part of our philosophy. So this is sweet.
And Kathy, I had never really thought too much about the whole aspect of going back to teachings of ancient Egypt and Hermes, as being an aspect of science of mind, because it's not something that's often mentioned or taught in any of our stuff. And so to read this book and then to go back and read Holmes talking about the Hermetic teachings and their influence on him, it actually, it sort of, for me, gave credence to the fact that Holmes was obviously well aware of the Cabalian and the concepts of Hermetic teachings. So I guess I should say, what are we talking about with Hermetic teachings? Let me just mention a note on that. The aspect is that in ancient Egypt, before the modern times, there was a wisdom traditions that were passed down orally. Depending upon who you hear or talk to about them, these could go back for, the time of Moses, or, they were influential to many of the people who were in the Old Testament of the Bible. But they were wisdom teachings that were handed down and attributed to an Egyptian god called Thoth, but never actually written down. And of course, if for those of you, as a quick refresher on Egyptian history, in the latter ages of Egypt, the Greeks and Alexander came in and took over, and they started taking the traditions of Egypt and writing them down. So you had the Hellenistic Greeks coming in, and for the first time, taking the oral traditions of the ancient Egypt teachings and putting them in writing. Well, the Greeks had a god named Hermes. And they noticed that the writings that they were attributing to the Egyptian Thoth were related very much to what was coming from the god Hermes. And so when they wrote down and transcribed the oral traditions, they attributed the Egyptian to somebody called Hermes Trismegistus, which for many, many years was seen to be a name of a person. But the name actually means thrice great, or 3 times as great as Hermes. That's what the name means. And so what many people and scholars now tend to believe is that the writings that the Greeks transcribed of the ancient Egypts were signed not to a person named Hermes Trismegistus, but the Greeks were trying to say that the writings and wisdom contained were 3 times as great as their own god Hermes. These writings were then put into books that were, comparable to the time period of many of the early books of the Bible, or the books of the Gnostics. And in fact, in some of the recent Gnostic book scroll findings, there were books that came from that relate to the Hermetic traditions. So this is where it actually comes from. And then the books went underground during the Middle Ages. They were found during the Renaissance. And in fact, one of the famous patrons, Medici in Florence, Italy, had his translators transcribing one of these ancient books, and they were started studying them. And that's where many of the books of the Hermetic tradition were first rediscovered, after the Dark Ages. And there's another, and these books are, they're called the Hermeticum or the Hermetica, and they're also called the Corpus Hermetica, which is a list of the books. And there's another document called the the Emerald Tablet, a very short document. And these all in aggregate contain what are seen as these ancient teachings from Egypt. And so these, fast forward, you got William Atkinson, who then decides to write a book called The Cabalian, where he's going to summarize the ancient Egyptian teachings into principles. And how does he do that? Well, the first thing he does is he doesn't put his name on the book. He pretends he's writing as three initiates who are bringing forth the teachings of the Hermetic tradition from ancient Egypt, that they are, he references and uses as a literary device the reference of another book that he quotes from in this book. The ancient book that he quotes from is called the Cabalian. The Cabalian doesn't mean anything. It's a made-up word. You know, many people think it's sort of like is reference to the Kabbalah, tree of life from the mystic teachings of Judaism, but it's a made-up word. And what it references, though, is when you read this book, is it's talking about a book, an ancient book called the Cabalian that it quotes. And so you've got three initiates writing a modern day book that references science and stuff like that, but also talking and quoting an old fictitious book called the Cabalian, which is supposed to be hundreds or thousands of years old, that summarizes the Hermetic teachings from ancient Egypt from thousands of years ago. So you hear that story, and it sounds like so much, BS that you want to discount this right off the bat. Right. It's a bunch of but it's all literary devices. It's all literary devices to bring forth what actually are the some of the best summaries of the Hermetic teachings that ever presented. In fact, most people now use this book as the source book for going back to getting the Hermetic teachings because it summarizes it so well. And in fact, recently, Mitch Horowitz, in his analysis of it, he went back and I've been reading the Corpus Hermeticum, and I would have to concur with him that most of the concepts that Atkinson put down in the Cabalian are actual good summaries of concepts that were not summarized quite as well in those Hermetic teachings that were brought forth from the transcription of the oral traditions that the Greeks did back in 2,000 years ago. So what he's done is do a service of summarizing those concepts for us. So what are those concepts would be your next question. So I'll pause there, but that's the next one. That's where I'm going.
Wow, it's like a mystery. The whole thing is like a kind of mystery literary tale that he's taking us on a journey. He's taking us on a journey, not only through his writing, but also through the way that he's creating. It's like a theater. He's creating this atmosphere of authors and names and mystical kind of meanings that he's given to things, like a facade. And yet the truth is that it's a facade. The truth is there within the pages. It's beautiful. I love it. It's so exciting.
He's making a myth while he's making a whole myth around this book. That it's written by these three people when it's only one person. That it's all about a book that didn't exist, which he fully quotes from off and on in here, but the kernels of the wisdom that are in the book is what's really important, and that's where I think that's why I encourage people to read this, because it gets into the key principles that he outlines, and you go, wow, this makes so much sense, and it puts other things in perspective, and that's why when I think that Holmes in his later years says, that one of the key influences on Science of Mind was the Hermetic teachings. He's referencing the same concepts that are in this book and summarized by William Walker Atkinson. So, yeah. And so I know we don't have a whole lot of time to go through all the concepts, but I do want to just mention them briefly. He outlines in this book 7 what he calls principles. And each one he then elaborates on. And I'll just cover these real quickly. The first one is the principle of mentalism. The principle of mentalism. And what does that mean? Everything is mind. All is mind. That we live in a universe of mind. And so that's one of the key teachings of science of mind, is that all is mind. You know, he begins by talking about what he calls the all. He even uses, interestingly enough, the phrase, this is in 1908 in this book, the thing itself, to reference the all. And most of us who are students of science of mind know that's how Holmes writes about God or spirit or the all, as the thing itself. And then when I see Atkinson writing that, 15, 20 years before Holmes, it's interesting that somehow or another there had to be, some crossover of thoughts or processes here. The thing itself, or the all, is everything that is. So when we talk about the inclusion of all that is in the world, the oneness of all that is, that's what the all is. But Atkinson writes that this first principle of mentalism is that the all is mind, that everything is mind. And then once we get that on, it's not just stuff out there, it is mind. And we have to lock into that as a very first beginning aspect of the concepts. The second concept is what is called the principle of correspondence. We know this too from science of mind and others, but it's when we hear it often and know it as above, so below as above. Well, this is one of the Hermetic teachings. That is that there's realms of being. That there is the realm of spirit and there's the realm of form. And in fact, what Atkinson puts out in here is that there's actually multiple. We have to look at the world as not only is everything mind, but there's the world of spirit, there's the world of mind, and then there's the world of form or matter. And that so the correspondences are between these realms. And so we know it when we talk about the fact that if you change your thinking in the realm of mind, you're going to change your effects in the world of form. But we're also but it works backwards as well, is that things in the world of form, as we often know, can get so mesmerizing to us that they change our thoughts, that our thoughts often correspond to what's going on in the world of the form in front of us. But that also there's a correspondence to the world of spirit. And so that in the spiritual world, there is the perfect ideals, which can be manifest into our thoughts, which can then bring about in form. So there's this whole flow between the law of correspondence in the various realms of who we're being. That's the second point of the Cabalian. The third is that there's what he calls the principle of vibration, that everything is vibrating, all is vibrating. And in fact, if we use the sliding scale of spirit down to matter, there's just a simply difference in degree of vibration. The things are vibrating at a very high frequency higher up, very low frequency at the lowest essence. And in fact, he says at the very highest nature of spirit, things are vibrating so fast they seem to be at a standstill. And at the lowest nature of the lowest forms, they seem to be vibrating so slowly, they seem to be at a standstill. But then everything in between is vibrating at different levels. And so then that gets into mental vibrations as well, and the attraction, the law of attraction, and as part of mental vibration. The fourth principle in the book is the principle of polarity, and that everything is on poles. That everything that appears to be an opposite is simply our false way of not looking and seeing the connection between things. So that good, when we talk about good and bad, there's not just essential good and essential bad. Everything is in a degree between good and bad, between hot and cold, between spirit and form. That there is a gradients of degrees. We tend to think I'm flipping out of form and into spirit. No, we're moving up a gradient in vibration, and to more into the mind, the realm of emotions and mind, and then into spirit. So that's the rhythm of polarity. I'm sorry, the principle of polarity. And then the fifth one is the principle of rhythm, that everything is moving back and forth, that there is a flow back and forth, and that we can see this rhythm. And so then what we want to do is to know that naturally all of life is a rhythm going from one flow and one side. And we can see that in our lives. Good things are happening, bad things are happening, We're in a pandemic. We're not in a pandemic. We're in the so we're in that. And and the thing is that what we want to do is to use the other principles, the principle of knowing that everything is mind and that there's a law of correspondence, to say, okay, I can mitigate. Things are going to move, but I can mitigate my reaction to it and control it more by using my thoughts. And the more I can control my thoughts, the more and the more I can then mitigate the negativity that I see when the natural rhythms of life move. So I tend to now move in a dance in the flow of life, rather than letting life, drag me from one place to another. I'm in a dance, and if I can get in that flow and in that rhythm, then I'm more joyous in the expression of life. The next principle in the Cabalian is the principle of cause and effect. That everything that is seen as an effect has some cause somewhere, and that cause gets into the concepts that we're familiar with in New Thought, that causes can be either primary causes in consciousness, or they can be secondary causes of form hitting form and making things happen. But what we want to recognize, that everything that we experience, either in our own awareness or in the world of form, had a cause somewhere. And for us to be able to track it back, those causes can be either other secondary causes in the world of form, or we can recognize the law of correspondence to see that the thoughts at some point, a thought somewhere created the initial form that led to the sequence of things that appear to be form hitting form hitting form. So that's the essential part of the law of cause and effect. And the final and seventh principle in the Cabalian is the principle of gender. Everything has sex. Everything has a creative aspect to it. And it's only, and get back to that sliding scale of spirit, mind, body. In the realm of body and matter, we tend to think of gender as sex, sexual acts, sexual union, etc. But sex is only the physical out picturing of the gender. Gender is a process of creation. And this gets back to why we often in Science of Mind talk about the fact that conscious awareness is masculine and then the law is feminine, because that's what they're really getting at, is that there is within everything at every level gender with creative ability. And gender reflects itself in the creative spark of the idea for creation, the word, and the aspect or the law that acts on the word to manifest the creation. So the law of gender is really about mastering the understanding that everything in life has the masculine and feminine genders, the ability to create the impetus for the new thought, the new creation, and the process by which it manifests, the law, that all of that is manifest in everything that is. And the more that we can manifest and see that we can tap into this creative law of gender, the more then we can use all of these principles in concert to be what Atkinson called the law of mental alchemy. Alchemy was often seen, by the many as you're going to turn gold, base metals into gold. It was all about the physical life. But the true part of transmutation is transmuting our thoughts to transmute our physical life. And that's what mental alchemy really is. All right. So that's a quick summary of his points.
Wow.
So now everybody needs to go read the Cabalian.
Yes. We have homework. I like that.
Wow.
Yes.
It's available for free in the public
and I
domain.
love how
you can get an ebook, or you can go buy a real good book of it.
I love how the way that he has outlined these 7 principles, and they're so aligned to Science of Mind. I mean,
Totally.
really are. It's just that they are, aren't they, Reverend Kathy? It's just that I feel as if he's picked out different. He's kind of cherry picked different areas. Maybe than at homes in the principles of Science of Mind and the core concepts of Science of Mind, which I can see how they are so aligned and yet they're different. And it gives me a different way of piecing this together. It's like he's unpicked it and put it back in a different way. It's really
Yeah,
interesting.
I really am. I'm with you on that, Laura. It's for me. I said, oh my God, this is making so much more sense of Holmes. It's making me go deeper with understanding Ernest Holmes and other New Thought writers because of the way Atkinson, and I think probably his legal skill and the ability to analyze stuff and boil it down in such nice, easy language. And put the concepts in such a way that you can go, wow, that makes so much sense. And then it also relates back to stuff you've learned and studied in other aspects of New Thought or Science of Mind. And you go, now I'm seeing what Holmes was talking about there at a different level than I did before.
No, I love that. And it seems
Yes.
like that it really talks about oneness. Everything begins and ends in unity and oneness.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and peppered through this, and I didn't stop to read some of them, are little quotes from the fictitious ancient book, the Cabalian, because throughout the Cabalian are quotes from the fake book, the Cabalian, which is supposed to be the wise book. Yeah, and I just give you a couple of quickies here. Here's talking about polarity. It quotes the old Cabalian as saying, "Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled." And and when we start reflecting upon these things, we start thinking, because we walk around in life and thinking, this is separate from this and this. They're separate and apart. They're opposites, and we tend to make this like build a wall between them. And the more you reflect on that, anytime you divide something into two, to stop and think about the fact that those two things really are the same thing in different degrees.
Yes.
And then you start seeing them differently.
Amazing. I created a podcast similar to that today about endings and beginnings, and it really is just the same thing.
Yeah.
Transmuting into a different experience. And I love it, this principle of rhythm, because in our teaching often there's this it can feel quite weighty, your thing, change your life, and then things don't go as we think they should be going. There's this thought process that can happen of, oh, I've got it wrong, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not I'm not work properly, or I need to be better at my own inner self, or my personal growth. There can be a kind of judgment that is placed upon life seemingly not working properly. And I love this principle of rhythm. He's accepting here that there is this flow, that it's not going to all look the way we think it should be looking, because there's this natural rhythmic experience that's happening where we have to experience all of it.
Yeah. And there's a perfection in that flow. We look at we can sit back and look at the tides, the movement of the moon and the planets, but there's a beautiful dance going on that is just that is really contributing to this overall flow of life. And for us to try to think anything out of life and say, okay, I don't want this part to flow, I want this part to be anchored where I want it to be anchored, then we're forcing the river, we're pushing the river in that, and trying to force something that is improper. And what we've got to find is our rhythm within that, and flow with it to the degree that we can. Here's how they quote the Cabalian on rhythm. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
And
I know you've spoken.
It's the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, it is. It is. Being in the flow, the Tao. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love what Fiona said. She said, dancing in the hermetic flow of life.
Yes.
I just think that's beautiful. And so if you could summarize, we're getting near the end here, and just and I know we've spoken to it, you've spoken to it throughout, but how would you say for our listeners here, our audience, how can they utilize this wisdom in their own lives? What would be your your kind of guidance?
Well, there's a couple of ways we can go with this. First, I would encourage people to go and read more about Atkinson and read Atkinson. I think the Cabalian to me is a great starting place, and I think that if you read it, you're going to find ways to employ the concepts immediately. If you're like me or Mitch Horowitz, you read it and you're going to reread it, and you're going to discover there are things in here that make so much sense that you're going to employ them. But I don't want to say that that's the only way. Atkinson's words and his other things are very well written as well. You go and maybe start with some of the free books that are out there. Download one of his Yogi Ramachakaraka books and read through it. You will find a lot of wisdom in him because his books had different focuses for different needs for different people. Some were, the esoteric. Some were the, for those who wanted to know more about Eastern religion. Some were more in the business world aspect. But go and taste some of his writings and discover him, because I think he's well worth reading. He's a very clear written author that speaks to us here in the 21st century from writings written over 100 years ago. To that, also, then, how can you employ it? One of the things, that I'll do a shout out to my website again. Back when I read the Cabalian, I did a 5-part blog series on it on my website. And the very last article and if you go to the blog site that's on the website now, just search for the Cabalian, and it will bring up all the ones that have the Cabalian in it. And there's about 5 of them, but there's one where I offered just 5 or 6 tips on how to use the Cabalian in your day-to-day life. And one of those we've already talked about, and that's like looking at life as a flow and moving to be more in the flow of life. But there's several other tips that I've put on there for using these concepts from this book that you can use, in your individual life. I think a lot of it is a reorientation. I think that all of us are students of new thought. The more that we understand a lot of the roots of people who are influential, the more that it deepens our understanding of what we're reading. Yes, we study Holmes or Fillmore or others, and we study many of the contemporary New Thought writers. All have words of wisdom for us. There's such value in going back to so many of these people who were prolific and influential in the founding days of New Thought. And I think a lot of their writings can still speak to us in these days.
Cool. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Profound. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun. I know I rambled on, but I got excited.
It was perfect. It was perfect. But that makes all of us excited.
That's why you're here, to ramble.
I know, exactly.
A great ramble.
Well, I hope everybody learned a little bit about Atkinson today and get encouraged to go check him out.
Thank you. And do you have any classes or workshops or talks or that way people could reach out to you and learn more about your sacred work? The Science Mind Archives is so blessed to have you on our board of directors, and we have a special committee called our Super Committee, which looks at our collections. What do we have? What do we need to bring in? And how to get it out to the world. And I will give a shout out that Reverend Mark has taken it upon himself to bring out, quote, in air quotes, new earnest homes on the Science Mind Archives website. I mean, he just took it. I mean, we're constantly adding new earnest homes on the sciencemindarchives.com website, thanks to Reverend Mark. But so how can folks kind of reach out and learn more about you?
Well, you certainly can go to my website, consciousbridge.com. There's links there to obviously all my materials, as well as a link to my YouTube page where I post videos. I've been taking some time off for the last month. But you're going to see new content coming out there very soon. As far as classes, I am teaching some classes for Centers for Spiritual Living. Anybody who is just going into Prac 1 this fall they can certainly sign up for that class. That's the only one I've got currently in the works. But I'm looking at some other content, and I'm looking to bring maybe something out about the Cabalian. I did I was leading a session at a men's retreat earlier this year and did a whole thing on the teachings of the Cabalian and applying them in our lives. And that may be something I'm pushed to do here shortly, because I think that this book is a very valuable tool for all of us.
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being here.
Yes.
We sure appreciate
My
you.
pleasure. Have me back, and maybe we'll talk about Christian
Thank
D. Larson.
you.
That'd be fun.
That would be
Love
amazing. Yes, that would be amazing. Thank you so much, Reverend Mark, for being here. And I know that you are presenting also on the Science of Mind conversations, the textbook conversations here on New Thought Media Network. So
That's right, including
listeners,
this
if you'd like to
Saturday.
hear more. This Saturday, there we go. So tune in this Saturday. New Thought Media Network. Mark will be sharing about a certain section of the textbook, and I'm not sure which
Teachings
section it
of the
is.
Mystics,
Mark
ironically.
knows which.
Oh,
There we go.
Teachings.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You're in a mystical week. And thank you to everybody that's been here, sharing and commenting. We really value you for sharing your insights and supporting this program and the network. Of course, we are a global focus ministry, ministering these teachings in so many different and wonderful and exciting ways every single day of the year. Wow. I think even on Christmas Day and all different religious and spiritual holidays, and we are here shining the light to empower us to know love. Basically, this is what it is. It comes back to knowing who we are as love. And so thank you for being here. And I'm going to quickly put the donate button up because I always do. If you feel called, if this feeds you and nourishes you and you love the vision of this ministry, then there is the link that you can share your love offering, Conscious Give, into New Thought Media Network and support this wonderful vision for the network. And thank you, Reverend Kathy, again. This is such a joy to be with you here.
absolutely. I love being with you too, Laura. We have a good time and we bring out the mystics out to the world. How wonderful is that? Yes. So blessings. Thank you, Reverend Mark. Thank you, everyone. And, feel free to check out scienceofmindarchives.com.
Thank you, everyone.
For all the good. And we'll see you next time on Wisdom of the Mystics.
Yes, next time. Thank you, Reverend Mark.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.